Hello and welcome to the latest edition of my podcast today. I'm absolutely delighted to have Lisa Nandy, the MP of Wigan, back with me. And Lisa's been an absolutely excellent advocate over the last few weeks, helping save this football club. So, Lisa, I saw you briefly earlier at the press conference with Joel Krasner, Paul Stanley, and the Wigan Athletic administrators. My first question to you is, what did you make of that press conference this morning?
Well, it was, how do I put this? It was pretty frustrating. We knew it would be. It was no great surprise, but it was enormously frustrating to be at this point in the, months after we were put into administration, when we've had big promises made all the way through this process. Last time I was in that room was at the start of this process, where we were told by the same administrators that there were 50 interested parties, that they'd never failed yet. And here we are with a few weeks to go until the new season starts. And it appears that no real progress has actually been made. There's been, to be fair to the administrators, they have taken steps to make sure that wages are paid. And we've finished the season, although that is largely thanks to the supporters club and to the fans. But we should be at the stage now, no question about it, where we've secured a buyer, and we should not be in this place. That's why we've launched this appeal with the supporters club. It's why we're asking people to come forward and help us and putting together a business plan for a fan takeover, because I think it was pretty clear at that press conference that in the end, the people who have the interests of the club solely at heart are the fans and this town, and we're the people who are going to have to step up and make sure that we safeguard the club's future.
Absolutely. What are your main frustrations with the administrators? What is the biggest problem you've seen over the last couple of weeks? Because I know you mentioned briefly that we should probably have a buy by now, especially on the first presser with 50 interested parties. I believe Joel said there was 75 non-disclosure agreements. And if there was 75 non-disclosure agreements, how was one not signed?
Yeah, it's not been very clear from the beginning, actually, whether how many people were interested, or how many NDAs actually went out. It's been very difficult to get a clear picture of that, and I think today's press conference was completely pointless. I think it didn't clear up any of the outstanding questions that fans have. And actually, I think it's quite unhelpful to be having ongoing questions and speculation about buyers and information leaking into the public domain about potential bids that are out there. It was half information, not real information. And that makes things even more difficult for the people who are actually left in the process. So that's, one big frustration is that, my reflection on this after months of working with local investors, international bidders, the administrators, the council, club staff, the fans at Supporters Club and others, is that there's very little trust in the system. And because of that, it makes it very difficult to get people to just sit down and talk to each other. I don't think things like today help at all. We've had this process going on for some time where the administrators have been saying if people are interested, then they've got to put 100 grand up front before they can see the documentation. That has been really difficult for a lot of the bidders. And I can say that with some confidence because I've met with most of them now. And, at least the realistic bidders, the people who have put in a bid or are likely to put in a bid pretty soon, that 100 grand up front requirement has been really off-putting to a lot of people. They understandably, if they're going to take on a huge multi-million financial commitment, they want to see some of the paperwork. They want to understand the lay of the land before they make that offer. So that has now been dropped. I think the administrators confirmed that today. They've certainly confirmed it to me privately. That is helpful because it means that you might get a much more open dialogue and things might start moving a bit more quickly. It's also that it's just been a moving feast for months. So it was always going to be the case that there were going to probably have to be some player sales. Wage bills had to be met. The club was anticipating selling a couple of players at the end of the season anyway. But the way in which this has happened, where it's been impossible to work out from one day to the next who is, which assets the club actually has, who's leaving, and when. The whole debacle around the training ground, where there's been multiple parties that have been interested, there've been mixed messages coming out of the administrators, and then the news emerging over the weekend that came as no surprise to anyone today when it was announced that it had been sold. I mean, they wouldn't say who it had been sold to, but I'm fairly sure that every single person in Wigan knows who it's been sold to. It's just really unhelpful because it means that the bidders who are left don't know what they're actually buying, and they want to be certain about what they're buying. And then the one thing that there was no clarity about today, I don't know what you thought, but it was quite striking that the question that wasn't answered was about the administrators' fees. And there was some kind of suggestion that the administrators would waive some of their fees, but it wasn't at all clear what that meant or whether that was accurate. And that is one of the sticking points for a number of the bidders, has been all the way along, is they want proper transparency about what is going to the administrators. They're prepared to pay the value of the club and its assets, but what a lot of buyers don't want to do is just put massive sums of money into the pockets of the administrators. And I think it's fair for them to ask for that information, and it just wasn't at all clear today. So it was a pretty frustrating experience. I was more minded to give them a fair hearing before it than I was afterwards. I think for the fans, for the staff who had to sit in that room and listen to all of that, it was a really, really difficult experience. And for a lot of them, I felt it was quite disrespectful to put them through it.
Over the next couple of weeks, what actions would you like to see from the administrators? Would you like to see more transparency, so not only yourselves to the fans? Because I know you mentioned then there's been a real lack of communication from the administrators.
Well, what we need them to do is focus entirely on getting a buyer and securing the future of this club. And today just felt like a sideshow. Lots of talk about, the players and, the worth of the players, how they've behaved, lots of sort of commentary about some of the bidders without naming names, but in some cases it was fairly obvious who they were talking about. I just want all of that to stop, and I just want a relentless professional focus on trying to secure the long-term future of the club. It is right to say, as the administrators did today, that there is still there are still interested parties. I don't think there are as many as they said, although they may, of course they have control of this process. They may know something I don't, but there is still interest in the club. And that would be everybody's preference. If we could find a buyer who would come in, who has the finance behind them, who was interested in the club and protecting the club, that would be everyone's preference. But I wasn't confident before today, and I'm certainly not confident after that press conference that is going to happen. And because of that, I've thrown my weight fully behind the supporters club and the club's chief executive, and we've put together this business case about taking over the club. A proper fan-led club, which is as it should be, and asking fans to put up some money to basically take over the club themselves. And it's been amazing. I don't know if you've seen it, but in the last 24 hours, raised over 100 grand. Every time I check my phone, it's gone up. And that's donations big and small. We do need more finance, but we've been talking to the council as well about what support they can provide, and I'm feeling reasonably confident now that we will get to a place in the next couple of weeks. It's going to take a lot of work between now and then, but we'll get to a place where we start the season and this club still exists.
Would you be able to delve into more about this business plan through the fan-led bid? I know yourself has pledged £250 this morning to obviously show that you're practicing what you preach. So can you maybe go into more detail about that, go into detail who you've spoke to about this project, and obviously the realistic aspect as well? Can it actually happen? Is it a possibility, or is it just a bit of a pipe dream at the moment?
So I think it is a realistic prospect. So a lot of fans will be familiar with Jonathan Jackson, who's the club's chief executive. He was made redundant as part of this process, but like a lot of the staff at Wigan Athletic, he's been in every day. He's been working around the clock to make sure that the club survives. And he's a really, he's Wigan through and through, and he's a really safe pair of hands as well. So very experienced in the business. So he's been enormously helpful. And I think he's known, and I've known, and the supporters club have known for several months now, that it may come down to this. When you go into administration, you lose control of the process. And so we were always mindful of the fact that we may get to the point where this would be the option. The reason it wasn't our first choice option is just simply the finances of it. So at the press conference today, I think they went through the figures in quite some detail. But essentially, for the club as it currently stands, we'll need to show that we can keep it running for the next couple of seasons. And that is somewhere in the order of around £4 or £5 million. So in order to be accepted as the new owners by the EFL, we would have to show that we'd raised that amount of money, if not in the bank account on the day that we apply, at least that it's a dead cert that that money is going to be ours and that we can do this. Now, I'm fairly confident that we can do that. But we do need fans' help. And that's why I put 250 quid in this morning, because that's the amount we're asking people to donate if they can. So £250 buys you, I think you get your name in the stadium. £500 buys you more access than that, and £1,000 buys you a bit more than that, but you get a say over things like ticketing prices and stuff like that. So we've tried to do it in these sort of tiered blocks, because that will really help us. We know from other clubs like Portsmouth, who we've been talking to, that that's how you get to the amount that you need to raise. But we've also been talking to local investors, been talking to local businesses, been talking to the local council, and so the council are very, very keen to help. They're a public body, so they can't just overnight just magic up money, but they've been working very closely with us, and I'm feeling very confident, very optimistic that we'll get there.
Absolutely. I think the biggest question the fans have had is this sustainable over a long period of time? Will it be the case of once you bought the club, it'll be able to kind of almost live in its own means, the club will be able to support itself, or will it be a constant case of fans being asked to donate to keep the club going?
So that is probably the right question to ask, and it's the one that we've been grappling with as well. None of us would want to put together a plan that only gets us through a few months and then just becomes unsustainable. To be honest, I don't think that the EFL would accept that either, and the Wigan Council wouldn't be able to offer support on that basis. We've got to have a proper business case. When we talk to other clubs that have done this, Portsmouth have been enormously helpful, and the Football Supporters Association have been great. And I'm talking to another club this evening, in fact, in about half an hour, just after I finished talking to you, about how they did it as well, a fan-led takeover. They had all the same issues about, it's not sustainable to ask people in towns like Wigan to keep stumping up millions of pounds every year. And there are different ways of doing it, but what they do is they take it over on behalf of the fans so that you can stabilise the situation. It would be far preferable, in my view, if the fans and the club were in control of what was happening, because we lost control when we went into administration and we haven't had it back. If we can get back that control and get through the next season, so we start the season and then we get through the next season, we can start thinking about future ownership models. Some of the bidders, for example, that I've been talking to over the last few weeks, they're very, very interested in the fans buying a stake in the club. It's something that I suggested to the administrators very early on. They dismissed it completely out of hand. They weren't interested at the time. They've changed their minds, I think, since they started to run out of options. But it may be that at some stage it becomes in Portsmouth, for example, they sold it to the managing director of Disney a few years later. But you have much more control then over who you invite in, and who gets to take over ownership of the club. And the fans, you can negotiate a fan stake as part of that, fans on the board. And so it becomes a very, very different prospect. So there's different ways that you can do it. And obviously, given that we're talking about a fan takeover, it would be for those fans as well to have an input into deciding about the future of the club at that stage. But we've got options basically when it comes to that. At the moment, where we are is that we're putting all our hopes on the administrators coming up with a buyer. It hasn't produced anything of substance yet. And so we've got to have a safety net in case that doesn't come off. And that's what we're putting together.
Why are you doing this so late in the day? Because obviously appealing for £500,000 yesterday, the Wednesday, just 5 days before the 31st of August deadline on Monday. Why has it resorted to this at such a late time in almost a final hour?
Well, first of all, we've been thinking about it for quite a while, so you can't just put a business case together overnight. So we have to work on some of the aspects of this. I mean, for example, we're quite far along with evidencing the sort of social value to the town of the club, which is an important thing to do if you're going out to local investors, and particularly to public bodies like the council, where you have to show that that it's right for them to invest in a project. So we've done a lot of the groundwork already. It's not like we're just starting from scratch. And in fact, when we talked to the EFL about it, I've been talking to them virtually constantly over the last couple of weeks, but they think that we're much further along than most clubs are who are in a comparable position at this stage. So that is really good news. But also because there is a question of timing. I mean, we've been told from the start of this process that there were lots of bidders who were interested. 50 was the original number. We've been told today 75 non-disclosure agreements have gone out. Of course, one of the things that you don't want to do is end up with the supporters club and the fans being played off against other bidders. We want to secure a bidder who has the funds that they need to secure our future and has our interests at heart. And if that's us, then we'll make sure that that works. But if that's somebody else, I would very much welcome that. And so, it's never been our sort of plan A option, this, but the supporters club was approached at the very beginning because that's, part of the rules say that they have to be approached about potential ownership, but it's a big financial commitment, as you said. And so if there was a prospect of getting a buyer to come in who could do this, at one stage it looked like the Ian Lenagan bid, for example, might be that, but there were others as well, then that would have been great news. So we didn't go out and launch a public appeal for that reason, but we're not prepared to leave this to chance. And Monday is not the deadline. The administrators confirmed that today, but I think we all really knew that was their deadline. That's not a deadline. And if this goes right to the wire, which it may do, there may be a bidder at the 11th hour. I've been told that there's a new bidder who's come on the scene in the last 24 hours. So there are still options out there. We won't know until later. But the key thing is that if we raise this money, we get this business case together, we talk to the EFL to make sure it's something that they could approve, then in a couple of weeks' time, if nothing else has materialised, we will make sure that this club starts the season and continues to survive.
You mentioned just then in your answer in terms of Ian Lenagan and his bid. Earlier in the press conference, Gerald Krasner made a reference and claimed that Ian Lenagan has not bid for the club. What is your understanding of Ian Lenagan's interest?
So I haven't spoken to Ian for a few weeks, but my understanding has always been that if he could raise the finance, Ian's preference was to bring Wigan Athletic and Wigan Warriors together under a sort of one Wigan banner. So to keep it local, to keep it going, to make sure that the Warriors and Wigan Athletic could continue to use the stadium. You'll probably know more than me about this, Jay, but for the purposes of the EFL, Wigan Athletic have to have priority access for fixtures. We have to be able to satisfy them that we can do that. So, and Ian, as a former chairman of the EFL, is well aware of all of that. So, has always been of the view that if that's what he could achieve, that's what he would try and achieve. And I don't think he'll mind me. I don't think he'll think it's breaking confidence to say that he's been working around the clock to try and put that together. He's been talking to all sorts of interested parties, fundraising, and trying to make that stick. I was actually quite dismayed by the way in which that was presented at the press conference, because I think it's right to say that there are certain bidders who, if they couldn't bid, if they can't get a bid accepted for the whole thing, including the club, that they would be minded to bid for various bits of the property, whether that's the stadium, the training ground, which has already been sold, or Sharpies. It's not right to suggest that, as was suggested at the press conference, that the interest of Ian Lenagan and the Warriors is just to come in and start taking bits of real estate out of the club. That's never been my understanding of where they were, and it doesn't fit at all with the reality of what I've seen happen over the last few months.
That's a really good answer and really insightful. Obviously, there is a possibility that, the admin said, although they're not looking to sell the DW Stadium at this time, they may do eventually and sell it separately. Is there a possibility that the Wigan Council can buy the remainder of the ground and rent it to both Wigan Warriors and Wigan Athletic?
So that was the bit in the press conference that was the most baffling, because the administrator seemed to say that he wasn't going to sell the stadium separately, and then when he was pushed on it by the Wigan Evening Post, it became quite apparent that they would do that at some point. So he said, not at this point. My understanding has always been that the preference of the administrators would be to sell the whole thing together, but if they can't sell the whole thing together, they'll sell it off piece by piece, and that they will still do that. So they've already sold the training ground at Exton, and my understanding is if it came to it, they would sell the stadium and Sharpies separately. And then, as the administrator said today, they would give the club to whoever wanted it for £1, which is, was quite a dismissive way to sort of say it, but I suppose we are where we are. The council owns a stake in the stadium, as you know already, so they do have some say over what happens, in particular about how it's used, and they've been absolutely clear from day one that the use of this stadium has to be for football and rugby league. So that's their major interest. And I'm not sure what the legal situation is, whether if it wasn't sold to anyone, whether they would have to purchase it or whether the ownership would just revert to them. But essentially, the council's interest, as relayed to me by the leader of the council and senior figures in the council, is that they want to make sure that that stadium is preserved for Wigan and for the use of rugby league and football. That's actually been really helpful that they've been clear about that from day one, because it's prevented the stadium being sold off to people who just want it for real estate. And there have apparently been people who've been circling, trying to pick that off for property development or commercial development, but because the council won't allow its use for anything other than football or rugby league, that's been really, really useful. So I think that's that's a good safeguard for us. And then if someone were to buy it, someone like Ian Lenagan, perhaps, if the administrators don't manage to secure a deal for the whole thing, I feel reasonably confident that with the council having a stake in that the club would continue to be able to use the stadium, and that in the event of a fan-led buyout, that wouldn't be the problem.
You've alluded to in this interview that you have spoken to potential bidders for Wigan Athletic. Can you lift a little bit more about that and who you spoke to? Not in terms of name, because obviously confidentiality, but can you maybe disclose some of the conversations you've had, and if you can, just elaborate a bit more, because I think the fans are quite interested to see what kind of parties are looking at the club, because we've not really heard much about that from the administrators, but obviously with the legal procedures and the confidentiality, anything could tip a deal. So I can understand from that point of view.
Yeah, so I've been speaking to a number of them over the course of the last few months, and it has changed quite a lot over that time. I mean, I'm quite new to this as well, so this has been a bit of a learning curve and an eye-opener for me as well, in terms of like who wants to buy a football club and why they want to buy it, and sort of trying to understand people's motivations. Originally, there were quite a few buyers who were interested, largely because we were a championship club, and because they were quite interested in taking on a championship club and trying to see if they could use different techniques to try and get us into the Premier League. And there's quite a big industry around that. I think, a lot of the fans will probably know this already, but, comes over from the US, where they've used similar techniques in sports like baseball to try to move clubs up. And so there's quite a few buyers that were interested from that point of view. All of that really fell away when we got the points deduction, and then the game with Fulham. So they were interested solely on the basis that we're a championship club. So they didn't come to much. A lot of them, that I spoke to at least a couple who were very decent people, who were football people, but that was their interest. So that didn't work out. Then there've been a few others. Obviously it's open knowledge, because he's broadcast it, that Ian has been trying to get together a consortium to run the club, and obviously I've been talking to him and to various partners that we've been trying to put together to see if there's a way of financing that. For various reasons, that hasn't really worked out. I think sometimes this is quite complicated, because in order to secure, as you alluded to at the beginning, the amount of money, the sheer amount of money that you need to keep the club going for a few years, that requires investors who think long term, who don't just want to make a quick profit, and who understand how the English football system works, which is a bit baffling often to people coming in from other countries. So that's been part of the problem too. The other issue that has surfaced over and over again is about the administrators' fees and the lack of transparency. People just really want to understand what the debt is, what it's owed for, and also what the administrators are charging. It's not because they won't pay the administrators' fees. I mean, they've come in, they're doing a job, that they have a right to be paid, and that's accepted. But nobody wants to pay over the odds for those fees. And so the lack of transparency around that, I think, has been quite difficult. At least that's the way I've been told it by a number of those parties. But there is still, there is a recognition that Wigan Athletic is not a failing club. So that's why I think there's still continued interest in this, despite the fact that it's dragged on for so long and we've seen so much damage done with players being sold and assets being sold. Because we're not a club that was in huge amounts of debt. The deal that the administrators have done with the previous owner means that potentially you're buying a club that, once you've paid off the administrators, is debt free. So it's, there's still reasons to be optimistic about the potential for an outside buyer. But if not, we've got this plan B, and we're going to make sure that it works.
You just alluded to the loan of the 25 million being waived away by the previous owner, Au Yeung Wai Key. What do you make of that? Because obviously, from an outsider looking in, there's someone who could not run a football club for the finances during the pandemic to suddenly be able to waive away a substantial loan of over 25 million. It just emphasises how bizarre this situation is.
I mean, I can't tell you at all what's happened, because, like everybody else, it's just completely baffling. But I can tell you a bit about the sort of speculation and stuff that I've been hearing. That essentially, there's one sort of school of thought that says that it wasn't his money to start with, so he's not, that it wasn't in his interest essentially to pursue that debt that was owed to him, because it wasn't really his. And if there was a potential for some kind of legal action over the way in which that loan came to be agreed, then it just wouldn't be worth his while to pursue it. I mean, that's the only sort of vaguely sort of understandable sort of rationale that I've heard put forwards. But I think the truth is that we just don't know at the moment. That it's one of the reasons I pushed the EFL to do an inquiry, and they are doing an inquiry, and push them to make sure that the scope of that inquiry is not just how did the EFL come to allow the ownership of this in those circumstances, but actually what on earth has been allowed to happen to our club. Because I think I said at the beginning that this is a global financial scandal. I strongly believe that it is. The further you dig into it, the murkier it gets. And there are people who are going to have to be held to account for what has been allowed to happen to this club, and the people involved in this club, including a lot of staff who've lost their jobs, and a lot of fans who've gone through some serious heartbreak, and some young players who deserve better. And people are going to have to be held to account for that. But I think I've said from the very beginning that, time is of the essence, and securing the future of this club is the top priority. That's got to come first.
Will the government be potentially doing a review in the future? I know with the petition from the supporters club to review the effectiveness of the owners and directors test, they were said that there's going to be a fan-led review. In my experiences, the fan-led reviews often aren't as effective. What can you put into place to ensure that not only this will be investigated thoroughly, but there's a possibility that it won't happen to another club? Because I won't wish what's happened at Wigan Athletic to any rival, any club, because as you know yourself, you've been working around the clock tirelessly. It's absolutely awful for everyone connected to the town, to the club, to the Wigan Athletic family.
Yeah, it's it just makes you feel constantly like you've got this sort of sick, sort of gnawing feeling in your stomach. And I know this already because my stepfamily are lifelong season ticket holders at Gig Lane, and when I talk to Bury fans now, I was talking to James Frith, who was the MP over there, who tried to save the club, and he was saying that a lot of the fans, they get to like lunchtime on a Saturday, and they should be getting ready to go to the game, and they just feel utterly like bereaved by it because it's not there. So I just, that first of all, that's why saving the club has been our top priority from the word go, and not leaving any stone unturned in order to do it. But also, making sure that this never happens to anybody else. I mean, we've had so many of these now, not just Bury, but Bolton hit the rocks as well. And, we've seen it time and time again. The government has said a lot that they're going to have this review, and a fan-led review. I'm supportive of that in principle, but I am really getting sick to death of hearing it. I've spoken to the sports minister quite a bit during this time, and, asking for help, because we're in the middle of a global pandemic. And as the administrator said today, that is not helping Wigan Athletic situation at all. This is pretty unique circumstances that we've got no income coming into the club, which is partly their justification for selling all those players, and asking for help, asking for, guarantees that things will change. And all we get is there's going to be a fan-led review. I am just determined that they are going to be held to account for that. They've been saying it for years. And that's why we need people to sign that petition, because if we get 100,000 signatures, we can get a debate in Parliament and we can really start to force that change to come. I mean, I don't have a problem with a fan-led review at all. I think it's quite a good idea, but it's got to have teeth. It's got to be enforceable. We had a select committee report after Bury that made a whole series of recommendations, a number of which would have really helped to prevent what's happened to Wigan Athletic, and nothing was done about it. We can't just have review after review. If the government is going to do it, they need to get serious, they need to bring it forwards, and they need to make a commitment that they're going to implement the findings of it.
Yeah, I've always been a firm believer of actions speak louder than words, and there's only a amount of times fans can hear the words, we're going to do this, we're going to do this. If we're not actually seeing it, that's where fans are getting frustrated. And I know a lot of fans have been fearing a Bury situation at Wigan. Obviously, they are reforming now in the non-league, but it's just a really scary and daunting prospect for any football fan. My question to you now, and the last question that I'd like to ask is, what will you be doing personally over the next few weeks to ensure that not only will we find a buyer, but the right buyer to secure the long-term future of Wigan Athletic?
So I've got a couple of calls this evening, actually. So I'm going to talk to another club straight after this who have been through something similar, where they've taken over the club for the fans, just to make sure that works. And I'm going to speak to the leader of the council tomorrow, just to check about the sort of support that the council might be able to offer. They've got to go through the formal processes, and they've got to get agreement from councillors as well. So if anyone's got a local councillor, please email them and tell them how much Wigan Athletic means to you, and that you'd like to see the council supporting them. Because although I'm the MP, I don't represent the council. They're the people who make decisions on behalf of the council. So that would be really helpful. I'm speaking to the supporters club and to the chief executive on a daily basis at the moment, and speaking to the EFL quite a lot as well, because it's about getting everything lined up in the right order, so that we've got people have been worried that Monday was the absolute deadline. It isn't the absolute deadline. I just want to reassure people on that. The administrators have told it to me privately. They said it publicly today. The deadline really is when the season starts, and that means that between now and then we've got to make sure that we're still talking to buyers, and I'm doing that at the moment. I've been having ongoing conversations with them about what they might be able to do and whether they're putting bids in or not, and making sure that we're not all being played off against one another, and that we just get the right outcome for the club and for the town. But the other thing is that we've got to try and raise this money. So a lot of people are going to get paid either tonight or tomorrow. So we'll be having a really big push over the next 48 hours to say, come on, now's the moment where you've got a bit of money in your bank account. Just let us borrow a bit of it. And if we don't end up not needing it, it's all going straight back. You can press a button with crowdfunder, the money goes back, or it'll be used to buy a stake in a future club ownership model. So there's that as well. But the next week or so is going to be quite critical, because we'll have to submit the business case. We'll have to go through the EFL stages, and we'll have to make sure that we've done all of that in the right sequence, so that getting all the right permissions, starting the season, even if the whole process isn't completed, getting permission to do that sort of thing. So there's a lot of Zoom calls, chats, and all of this. I suppose the thing that I found most difficult about this, as well as the sort of morale issue and how emotional it is for a lot of people, is that you've got it changes a lot. So you think, okay, this makes sense. We'll get these people to put in this much, we'll get these people to do that. And then somebody will say to you, whether it's at the Football Supporters Association or the EFL, actually, that's not going to work, and here's why. And then you've got to readjust the whole thing. But that's what we're doing, basically. That's what the next week for me looks like. And I said to you a while ago, Jay, I think that this is my absolute priority. Like, this town is going to have a football club in a few weeks' time. I've been saying that from the start. We are going to make sure that it happens. We shouldn't be in a position where potentially nobody is nobody's going to step in and help, but we're going to do it. We're going to make sure that it happens. And, there was this video that Supporters Club released, we are Wigan Athletic forever. And that spirit is what's carried us right through this whole process, from the players going out on the pitch and giving it their all, to the staff turning up when they've been made redundant, and the fans putting up the money to get us through the season. And that is what's going to get us there and make sure that this club survives. So I don't, I'm not complacent at all, and there's a lot of work between now and then, but I feel really optimistic that we can do it.
That's absolutely excellent to hear, and on behalf of every Wigan Athletic fan, I'd like to thank you for everything you've done, not just over the last few weeks, but since this has happened. You've been a shining light of the town, in my opinion. You've been excellent in raising a voice for Wigan Athletic fans, giving a voice to the voiceless, attracting attention from the right people. I mean, you've got the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, even supporting you, and it's been incredible to see. And I feel like you deserve a lot of credit. A lot of people on social media do give you a bit of stick every now and again, and I think it's quite unjust. But I'd just like to wish you the best of luck with the process of the fan-led bid. And hopefully when we next speak, it could be in a much positive light, where we're talking about the future of the club in a positive way, where there's not a cloud of darkness and worry over it. It's actually going to be a period of sunshine and optimism.
No, that's exactly right. And we've been saying this all along, over the last few days as well. Been down at the stadium quite a lot, and we've been saying to each other, like, there's going to be a big celebration when we save Wigan Athletic, but we've got to make sure that we get there. And then, from the beginning, I've said this club ought to have a strong, bright future. There is no reason why we should be in this situation, and we're gonna prove that over the next few weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a very busy individual. You've been very busy throughout this. I'll let you get off to your phone calls, but thanks so much for being a guest. We'll hopefully have you on the podcast soon. So thank you everyone for watching this podcast. Lisa Nandy's been an excellent guest, giving a lot of insight into a lot of questions the fans really needed answering. I know fans have been growing frustrated with the lack of answers we've had, a lack of transparency, but let's just hope this can make you feel a bit better. I feel a lot more optimistic after this call now, and hopefully this is shared. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys for the next one.